Um, Gavin Bryars, a legendary musician and composer, and Sam Thorne, associate editor of Frieze magazine. I'm going to hand right over to our speakers, but I just quickly wanted to remind you to silence your cell phones, and we're going to be selling Gavin's CDs after the talk in the bookshop. Thank you very much.
It's difficult and a little daunting to know where to begin with introducing Gavin Bryars' work for the last 50 years. So I thought I'd start with something that you yourself once wrote, Gavin. And I quote, "The French music critic and broadcaster, Daniel So, used to say that there have been three major new developments in music since the Second World War. The music of John Cage, American minimalism, and English experimental music. I've been lucky enough to have been involved with all three." So I think a very partial account of Gavin's life and work might include his performances with Derek Bailey in the mid-60s, a lot of which were here at the ICA. Soon after, he became an assistant of John Cage in the US. And in 1970, Gavin co-founded the Portsmouth Sinfonia, a collection of amateur and untrained musicians, the self-described worst orchestra in the world. In 1975, one of his best-known pieces, The Sinking of the Titanic, was the first record to be released on Brian Eno's label, Obscure. And as well as writing operas and playing regularly with his own ensemble, Gavin's also taught in the Fine Arts Department at Portsmouth and the Performing Arts Department at Leicester for many years. And he's collaborated with people as diverse as Robert Wilson, Etel Adnan, John Berger, Bruce McLean, Juan Munoz, and Tom Waits, who he once called the great voice of the century. So our conversation this evening, I think, will hopefully touch on at least some of this. Gavin's got a lot of music on his laptop, so we'll probably delve into some of that along the way. And we're going to talk for, I think, 45 minutes or maybe an hour, and then we'll move over to questions. So Gavin, to start with, it's the centenary of John Cage's birth right now. There've been a flurry of concerts, of publications. And you once said that your first interaction with Cage, your first seeing a performance of his, was one of the kind of the most important life-changing moments for you. So I'd like to kind of start with when that was. What happened there?
It sort of happened almost simultaneously with my giving up playing improvised music in November 1966. I'd been playing for a long time, with Derek Bailey and others, and one night in November, I played 3 dates the same day, Saturday, and at the end of the last one, I put my bass in its case, and I didn't take it out for 17 years. And shortly after that, I actually went to a performance. I took some students. I was teaching in Northampton in art college, and I took a bunch of students to see the Cunningham Dance Company at the Savile Theatre, which is now a cinema in Shaftesbury Avenue. And the first thing I saw was a piece called Nocturne, which is a group piece by Cunningham, but I only really remember one section of it where Cunningham dances solo. But it was designed by Robert Rauschenberg, and the design had the dancers in bright white costumes. There was a very brilliant white light, and there was a scrim at the front, so everything was just this white. And Cage played on the piano the 5 Nocturne of Eric Satie. And Cage actually was a very decent pianist. In fact, when he was 19, he had this idea of being a concert pianist, but only playing the music of Grieg. He liked playing those bare fifths, but I don't think he had much of a career doing just that. But anyway.
So what happened to that idea? Why didn't he continue?
I don't know. I think he probably found there is other music than Grieg, though Grieg's all right. But anyway, so that was the first thing I saw. I thought it was just stunningly beautiful. Then there was an interval, and then after the interval, there's this piece called Variations 5, where it was just completely chaos. There were dancers on the stage, but they were moving about in a very random way. There were all sorts of electronic beeps and plops going on. There were plants, plastic plants with contact microphones on them. There were photoelectric beams which would trigger off things in the pit, so there were all the sorts of things going on. Everything was done by chance. I thought it was just unbelievably magical. And when I saw that, I thought, actually, that's what I want to do. Not to be a dancer, even though then I did have the shape, and I still have in a certain lights. But it was, I realized that's what I wanted to do, that kind of work, to be in that sort of world where you're working at that level with that degree of, just interest. Otherwise, that's what I wanted to do.
And then what happened between you seeing that performance and then going to work with Cage in the US in the University of Illinois, I think?
Well, a few things. First, I went back several times to more performances, and then I think on the Saturday that week, many people remember this, there was Cage gave a performance. It was actually billed as a lecture. And basically, he sat down and everyone thought, we're going to have this lecture and you're going to hear how this stuff is done. And he had this thing that was like a kind of RAF helmet on with like a breathing device and stuff, and he started speaking. And after maybe about a minute or so, it started to get really distorted, and everyone thinks, oh no, there's something wrong with the sound system. And then it went on and on, and it went on for about an hour like this. And it was a performance. And then he did other things. There was a piece by Robert Ashley that Gordon Mummer performed called The Wolfman. And Gordon Mummer performed a piece called Horn, where he plays a French horn with an oboe mouthpiece, all of it sort of using electronics. It was fantastic. And after that performance, I went backstage and met Cage. I was very nervous. I was not a pushy type, nor am I still a pushy type. That I was with a friend who was more pushy, and he said, let's go backstage and meet. I was like, no. And we did. And Cage was incredibly nice, very civil, was just generally interested to see what people were up to. And so he asked me what I did, and I explained. And so he asked me if I'd send him some music, and I sent him a couple of pieces. And both these pieces he put into this collection of notations he was doing at the University of Illinois. And that was it. And I remember I was teaching at this college, and then I had to apply for a job somewhere, I think a teacher training college. And I had to have a referee, and I couldn't think of anyone, so I wrote to Cage, and by return there was an airmail handwritten letter on those. You remember those airmail forms, which are just you kind of fold to save weight? Handwritten letter saying that it supported my application. I think the college never heard of Cage, so I didn't get the job. And then in 1968, I was working with a dancer, and I had this invitation to work at the University of Illinois with this dancer. I'd met him in London. I'd done some pieces for him, and he wanted a piece for this kind of show he was doing at the University of Illinois. So the deal was, if I could get out there, he would give me, financial support for the time I was out there. So I managed to get there, and on the way out, I stayed 2 days in New York, 2 weeks in New York, and I bumped into Cage at a college, at Hunter College, and he remembered me. And it turned out that he was also going to be in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois for 2 years on a fellowship. So we would be in each other's company. In fact, there's one thing I do remember, which was one of my near misses. He said, do you play bridge? And I said, well, I sort of know how, but not really. He said, because he needed a bridge partner. He was playing bridge that night, and his normal partner dropped out. And so I said, no, sorry. It turned out it would be me and him versus Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. And in the end, it would look great on my CV, but I couldn't face the shame of knowing that I'd let myself down in that company. So it's one of the near misses, but thank God I didn't play. If I'd played bridge, I would have done it. And then we did find ourselves together in Illinois, yeah.
And what was happening exactly there? Because, I mean, from what I've read, you were working on this project. I think NASA were involved, or at least you were borrowing slides from NASA.
They used some imagery, yeah.
Yeah, which was for this piece called Harpsichord, or I think an abbreviation of that.
HBSCHD. Yeah.
And so were you working directly with Cage on this piece, or?
No, it was much more casual than that. I mean, I was working there with this dance, and I was doing other things, and I got involved with all sorts of other musicians, and I was in Cage's company, and nobody really studies with Cage. You find yourself in his company, you work on projects together, and I remember my visa was running out, and so I had to renew it, but I had a tourist visa, so I wasn't allowed to work, and he knew that, but he knew I needed to finish this project, so he said, well, I actually need some help on this project I'm doing on with this computer piece, Harpsichord, and he would pay me $200, I think it was a week or a month, it might have been a month, because it was quite a lot of money then, and I did manage to get a few jobs playing bass in a roadside diner. And so he employed me out of his own pocket, out of his own generosity, knowing that I needed to stay, which was incredibly nice. And so I was working with him on this. It was just I was doing tasks, doing technical things in order to achieve this piece. But I was in his company and so on. And in the end, everyone who has spent time with Cage, it's not just the actual artistic work that you do together. It's the being in the whole kind of climate of his work and being part of that spirit.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, of his students and of his friends, what's quite odd or unique about him as a teacher is that, you never really trace that influence. No one sounds like John Cage. None of the people who were taught by him actually sound much like him.
Yeah, it's like, if you went to, at that time, if you went in the 60s to study with Boulez or Stockhausen. If you didn't sound like that, you were doing it wrong. Whereas in the case of Cage, he'd been very surprised if anyone started doing things with chance operations and prepared pianos. To him, he wanted to let you go away and do what you did the best way possible. And he sort of gave this permission to go away and be yourself and just do it in the right spirit. And that was it. So the great thing of Cage as a teacher is that no one is a clone of Cage, which is great.
And then to move on to a piece that I'd always associated with the mid-70s because it was when it was released, but the Sinking of the Titanic, I know now, had a much kind of earlier life as something kind of closer to an instruction piece that I think you started on in the mid-60s, which I guess must have been quite soon after this time with Cage.
Yes, it was. It's just actually, ironically, it's the centenary of Cage and the Titanic the same year. Cage was born 6 months after the Titanic went down. But no, I did this piece. When I came back from America, I found myself working in art colleges. It was just a kind of a fact of life that people who were making music and performance in the way that I was doing, and others like Cardew and John White, Chris Hobbs, these people, we were not really seen as serious, and we were not taken seriously by the establishment or given things like Arts Council grants or commissions from the BBC or proms or whatever. And so we made our own world. We were not employable in music departments or conservatoires, but the art colleges were open and friendly. And there's this strong link between the art colleges and this sort of area of new music. Cage had taught at this place called the New School for Music Research, Social Research in New York. And out of his classes in 1958, the whole generation of people, George Brecht, Alan Caprow, Lamont Young, all went there, and that started that whole period of the happening Fluxus, eventually minimalism for Lamont Young. And so in a sense, there was always that strong connection between Cage and that kind of art world. And so the art world recognized that area of music as being of interest. So I worked in art college. There was a few others who worked in different places. I taught in Portsmouth for a time, and then later Leicester. But in Portsmouth, I did this little piece, the Titanic, because there was, at that time, the students I was working with were not really working on painting or sculpture or printmaking or any of the more traditional forms. They were trying all sorts of things, and there was an element in the college, not surprisingly, which was more conservative, who felt that this sort of thing was not the kind of thing that ought to be going on. And so these people were under attack, and they put on an exhibition and asked if those members of the staff who were sympathetic would contribute. So I did a single side of A4, a kind of sketch of what might be the sinking of the Titanic. And at that time, the area of art that was interesting to me was conceptual art. And in a way, I always found that the fine art world was much more ahead aesthetically in terms of the kind of questions they were raising than the music world. The music world would generally...
When you say conceptual art, what kind of work would you have been looking at? What would you have been exposed to at that point?
Well, at that time, it would be... Some of the early things would be maybe Joseph Kossuth, who, ironically, I met for the first time a couple of weeks ago. It's a great guy, we got on really well. And some of the later, a little bit later, some of the art language people. It was sort of post-Duchamp.
Right, but you were seeing this stuff in London or via magazines? Or?
Some of it was in London. There was the odd thing here at the ICA. I was in an exhibition here in 1968 called Cybernetic Serendipity. And things were starting to be shown. There were some Fluxus exhibitions, there was some pop art exhibitions. It's just that the questions, the kind of possibilities in the art world were far wider than in the music world. No one in music was really doing the equivalent of pop art. I mean, there were pop musicians, and the people who do a little bit of kind of pop in inverted commas in a classical piece, but it's kind of like, look how clever I am. I know what young people get up to, popular beat combos and that kind of thing. But in the art world, they were much sharper, I felt. In fact, when I was a student, a university student, as a philosophy student, all the girlfriends I had at that time were all art students. The art college people were much better dancers. They were better looking, they were more fun, they did drugs. Oops, all that kind of stuff. They were much more lively, and I stayed with that world. My first wife was an artist, but my second wife is a filmmaker. So there's a kind of sense in which one stays in that world because they're more lively.
And what kind of form exactly the Titanic piece had? It to start with, it was a single side of A4.
It's typed script, and it just talked about what a piece might be. It described the basis on which the speculation starts, that is, the reported fact of the ship's orchestra, the band, having
we can probably
played.
play some of this now, actually. Should we put some on?
Yeah, if you like. I'm not sure I've got anything which is... I'll play a little bit in a second. Okay. But this thing was really saying about the what happened as the ship went down. In fact, you could show that. I think there might be some Titanic visual stuff, which is all very... I don't control this, but he... no, that's not it. No. It's probably some of the very first things.
I'm not sure if it's on this one.
All right. Okay.
I think this is it.
Is it?
I mean, this could set the scene, but I don't think it's...
Well, this in fact is the North Atlantic. It happens to be the Faroe Islands, and they're roughly on the same latitude, but the wrong side of the ocean. Apart from that, sets the scene. So it was the reported fact of the band having played as the ship went down, and just speculation about what would happen the moment when music being played hit the water, and the fact there was no report of them having stopped. In fact, quite the opposite. The one report that we had, which was reliable, said that they didn't stop playing.
And there were slightly conflicting reports about what they might have been playing as well?
Yeah. A lot of the reports said, I got to the person who's most reliable was a wireless operator called Harold Bride, who said it was a hymn tune called Autumn. And he was 150 feet away in the water with a lifebelt around him. And he said they were playing Autumn, and how they did it he couldn't imagine. And it's fantastic. But so anyway, you have that little fact, or little probable fact, or possible fact. And then from that you work out what can this lead to? And so the first thing is to think, well, is there something... For me, I felt there was something there in terms of performance. But what I did initially was to draft a lot of ideas. And my idea, because of conceptual art, was that by reading this piece of paper, reading it, and the notes surrounding it, you would construct the performance in your own head, a kind of private performance which is generated by the text. So it was a kind of private music that I was interested in doing that time. It certainly wasn't commercial. You don't get any royalties from private music. But the idea was that that was it. And so that by reading this, your imagination is stimulated, rather like the way your visual imagination might be stimulated from a radio broadcast. But then, 3 years later, a concert promoter, Victor Schonfield, said, that's all very well, but I'd like to put on a concert. If you were to hear it, what would it sound like? So then I had to make a live performing version. And then, of course, it then comes out into the real world. But I can play examples of performances because I've lived with that piece for a long time. And Jane, who had been my manager for a while, is here tonight, and she once told me that, with the Titanic and maybe Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet, it's a little bit like the Rolling Stones. You'll always be asked to sing Satisfaction. And, don't resent it. People, that's why you've been invited. And so, rather than go out there thinking, oh, here we go again, another sinking. You go out there and you invest some energy and thought in it and you reanimate it and it comes alive. And the advantage of the Titanic was that in that case, I kept it in such a way that it was an open piece, so that if things arrive subsequently, I can incorporate them, other information, other ideas. I have some new ideas. It's not a finished piece. And it's still open. And I still do performances which are different. Maybe the differences are now more subtle than they were a while ago, but occasionally I did a performance in Birmingham this year, and the organisers there found that the whistles that have been used on the Titanic were made by Acme Whistles of Birmingham, and they still make these whistles. So they gave me 3 whistles, exact replicas of what had been used on the Titanic, and so I used them in the performance. I was very happy. The sponsors were happy, of course, but it was just a new thing. I actually now carry these whistles about with me. There's a danger this year of actually being what the Guardian called a Titanorack. There's so much of it going on, this Julian Fellows jibber jabber and all that sort of stuff. This upstairs, downstairs, underwater. It's a nightmare. But I remember this came, and I actually wrote a letter to the Guardian about it, saying I feel a little bit guilty being part of this world, but one thing that happened this year, which I think was actually great, was I got an email from a Belgian composer who'd done a piece based on the Titanic, asking if he could perform his piece alongside mine. And I said, well, that sounds interesting, but what's your piece? What is your piece? He said, well, I actually haven't done it yet, but it's from the viewpoint of the iceberg. Fantastic. So I said, yeah, okay. a badly reported iceberg, much maligned iceberg.
So at the risk of predictability, maybe we should listen to a little bit of Titanic.
Well, okay, I should play something. Actually, I have two examples of Titanic here, I think. And they from different circumstances. One, as I say, the Titanic was done in this early period, 69 to 72. And then I didn't play it for a while. And I was asked to perform it again in 1990. And by that time, of course, the Titanic, which at the time I'd written the piece, was a kind of a legendary object somewhere in the North Atlantic, somewhere off the coast of Nova Scotia, was now a kind of reality. It had been found. There were pictures, there was imagery. And so that changed things. And also there were some musical things that changed. I did some things because of what had been found. And I did this performance in a water tower in Bourges, in central France. And I did a couple of performances, and the Bourges one was particularly interesting because this water tower is on 3 levels. Actually, I sent some pictures, maybe you don't have them, but it's an old Napoleonic water tower, which had been neglected and disused for some years. And it's been rebuilt, and they wanted to make it into a sort of like a kind of a cultural space. So a friend of mine in France asked me if I would do the Titanic, and as it was a kind of a water environment, I thought, okay, I'll do it. And so what happened was that the band, there were 6 of us, we played in this basement area, the 3 levels. The audience heard it in the middle level, and they saw us through kind of closer TV. And the top levels, a big cavern, we used that as a reverb chamber. So the sound then went out of there and fed back into us, but it also went out of the roof into the town. So this was a kind of, and the idea, we were going to record this live for a Belgian record label. Someone then told us that, in fact, when the water tower was working, they remembered that there was a kind of fountain, a kind of cascade that came out of the front of the building. And everyone knew that the water tower was active. And someone found the tap for this and said, wouldn't it be great, when we're playing, sounds coming out in the air, we can actually see that, the water's there, the water tower's come back to life, it's back with us again. So, oh, great, okay, fine. So we started playing, and someone turned on the tap, and outside the water was trickling away. And we're playing, then I suddenly noticed this kind of water starts kind of lapping. And nobody worked out, where does the water go? And of course it comes back into the water tower. But we're recording live, directly, for an album. And we're on sort of riser, wooden riser about this high, which are full of like electrical plugs and all sorts of stuff. And this water started to lap around. We looked at my watch, we had like about 50 minutes to go, and you see the water gradually going up. And we're playing it. So I think I have a moment of that. But this is a kind of, it's a sort of near-death experience. I think there might be something of that here. So you can imagine a very nervous band. And around the same time, immediately after this, we were asked by the Belgian record company, the record was done, we actually finished the album and it was done, and we all lived to tell the tale. But we were asked to then play it in, which we knew to be a dangerous water environment, which was a renovated Art Nouveau swimming pool in Brussels. And we were to play on a raft in the shallow end. So there were 6 of us on this raft. We had all our instruments and percussion, everything, and which is great. The acoustic in swimming pools is fantastic. You know, if you go in the swimming pool and kids start screaming, it sounds bouncing everywhere. It's fantastic. Not nice, but fantastic. And but it's very small in terms of an audience. I think you get 2 aside all the way down the kind of one side of the pool and then a couple in the balcony. They get about 120 people. And they said, well, could we play it twice with a break in between? So I said, okay. So we played it first. And that's our performance at that time lasted about an hour. So we played it. And then we had a break of an hour and a half, had dinner, and then came back and played it again. Well, a couple of the band had, one too many Trappist beer, or maybe even wine, or both. And I remember somewhere in the piece there's a bass clarinet solo, and it comes at a certain time. And I looked across to Roger, who was playing the bass clarinet, and he was fast asleep. And so I had to prod him with my bow, and he walked up and played it. But then towards the end of the piece, Martin Allen, my percussionist, got very enthusiastic. He'd had a few as well. And he decided, here we are on a raft in the water. I'm going to do something. He took this big gong off its stand. He started hitting it and dipping it into the water. And it was fantastic. And so he just went crazy. And this is at this moment when Martin Allen sees the light. You hear the music going on, and you start to hear this kind of other sound.
So with these different, the different versions of the performing of this piece were so different. When it came time to actually release the record, which Brian Eno released in the mid-70s, how did that, that must have been possibly a difficult decision in terms of which version you went with, or?
Well, at that time there really weren't that many versions. There was a version I played live in London, the Queen Elizabeth Hall in '72. And that was essentially what we did. There was a shorter version because one of the things at that time was that we were recording for vinyl record. And the maximum duration for a side, if you didn't want to lose sound quality, was about 24 minutes. So I made the piece 24 minutes long. And similarly, the B-side was Jesus Will Have Never Failed Me Yet. I made that 24 minutes long simply because it could go on for much longer, and it has done since, but it was a physical constraint. So making it for that situation was extremely pleasant. It was a very nice working environment. I've known Brian for years. He was an art student in Winchester. And
is that where you first met him? Or?
No, he used to come down to concerts when John Tilbury and I were playing at the South Bank and so on. And I met him sort of a little bit after he left Winchester. But he worked, I think, for Ian Tyson, a printer next door to Tom Phillips. And he printed quite a lot of my scores in the early 70s. And then when he joined Roxy Music, in fact, for a time, he lived in an old flat that I had, a one-room flat in Kilburn. He moved in there, and there was a guy who actually was writing a book once on Eno. I don't think the book was ever published, but he said that he had this theory that from the early 70s, Eno was following me around and doing exactly what I did. So when I cut my hair short, he cut his hair short. And he moved into this flat that I had. He was printing my score, and it's a bit of a stalker, but Brian denies that now. He would, of course. He's got the money, I haven't.
And he was involved with Portsmouth Sinfonia, which...
Well, he was the person who enabled us to record. I mean, when Portsmouth Sinfonia came out, because I was teaching at Portsmouth, the art college, and that's where I'd done the Titanic. But we had this idea one day to do a kind of like an Opportunity Knox concert. And so we decided to form an orchestra, and we made this. The orchestra, none of the people knew how to play instruments. They all liked classical music, but they only knew it through popular culture. So they had to take something which was known through TV. So that's why we did the Lone Ranger, William Tell, because that was the theme music. And So we played this, and we were terrible. And we had 3 days to put the concert together, and everyone bought an instrument, and on the stand you had a photocopy of the piano reduction, the Rossini score, and you had a fingering chart for your instrument, you know, how to tune it and so on. So you're playing and looking at how do I do that and stuff. And the conductor was the guy who knew least about music, but he had a fantastic profile. He looked at all the pictures of Von Karajan. He had this long flowing hair and looked great, but his gestures were incoherent. Anyway, we did this piece, and it was vaguely recognizable. And the advantage of doing something which is from popular culture is however badly you play it, you will have an idea of what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So anyway, little by little, we added stuff to our repertoire. And by, I think, 1973, we had enough. And Brian Eno then joined the orchestra playing clarinet, which he actually couldn't play. But he produced the record, and of course he had connections to the record industry. So we had this album for Transatlantic Records, and we eventually made 3 albums. Yeah.
And I read a piece recently that was, I mean, maybe looking back at that period, I think it might have been in The Guardian, and it described it all as a big joke on your behalf, that you were maybe laughing at these people in the orchestra.
Not at all.
And which seems completely wrong to me. I mean,
no, we were all completely serious, and we were all trying our best. I mean, I was playing the euphonium, which I can't play. I bought it from a bicycle shop in Portsmouth, and everyone was doing their level best. We didn't rehearse, I must say that. And most people probably didn't practice in between gigs, but we did our best, and the humor that came about was simply the kind of byproduct between what people knew we were trying to do and what we actually achieved. And that sort of failure was the funny thing, but occasionally there were people who joined the orchestra, and people were added to it from time to time. And if someone tried to be funny, tried to be comic, I would ask them to leave, because that wasn't what it's about. Everyone was doing their best, and it was just the feebleness of what we were doing, which was hilarious. And sometimes there's some incredibly funny things happen. I remember when we did our live concert at the Albert Hall, which is our second album, and we did all the kind of repertoire you'd expect from a Sunday night with a Victor Hochhauser production. We did the 1812 with cannons and the rest of it. And we did a huge program of pieces, which would, if you saw the program, you'd realize it wasn't possible to play all those pieces in one night. It would take about 3 nights to play them. But anyway, I think there were only 3 people who came by mistake. I think it was some American tourists, and they left very quickly. But we did the 1812, and there, John Farley, the conductor, was in charge, and I think the cannons were £5 per explosion. And they're set off by a guy that was his job, and he had this thing in the balcony where he had these kind of metallic drums with detonators inside them, and he sets them off from a kind of a keyboard. And he's signaled by the conductor, and he's done the piece week after week. And we could only afford £30, so we could do 5 of them in performance and try 1 in rehearsal. So we tried this 1 in rehearsal, and the sound was enormous. The whole building shook. It was incredible. And this is really terrifying stuff. Anyway, so we started the piece, and then John suddenly realized his grandmother was there, and he was really worried it might trigger a heart attack. So he started signaling to this guy like this. So the guy set all 5 of them off straight away in the wrong place. So that kind of thing happened all the time.
But what happened to the grandmother?
She survived. I think she enjoyed it. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about your relationship to pop music, because I mean, whether it's these conversations with Brian Eno, or later, I know that you're included on the compilation From Brussels with Love, which was, I think, released in the early 80s. But I mean, that's your work alongside pieces by, bands like New Order, for example. And then more recently, you've been remixed by Aphex Twin, just to give one example. And I was reading an interview with Steve Reich where he was saying that what's interesting about today's generation of kind of younger composers is their proximity to or attention to pop music. But where it kind of seems to me that actually that's always been there with other members of your generation. But certainly with a lot of your work, that conversation has always already been taking place.
To an extent, obviously there are people like Tom Waits, and there's a lot of sort of pop people I've worked with. I don't think of Tom as pop really, but people from, let's say, that kind of vernacular music, who are remarkably intelligent people. You tend to think, they're up there chuntering away, and they're not that bright, but Tom is a very bright man. And people like Natalie Merchant, who I worked with, and Anthony Hegarty, they're bright people. And so those people, and I enjoy their company and doing projects with them. But I did have this time when I was like a jazz bass player. My day job, as it were, was working in a well, it's Greensboro Working Men's Club, which was like the kind of known as the Palladium of the North, where you actually had this run by the South Yorkshire miners, but they had people who were they were negotiating with Sammy Davis Jr. when I was there. And I played with people like Dusty Springfield, all kinds of people. I mean, Freddie and the Dreamers were top of the bill when I first played there. Dankworth was there, all kinds of people. And I found myself playing bass in that company. And I got to know a lot of that sort of, I worked with Vera Lynn. You know, I worked with David Whitfield, all these kind of slightly has-been people, I guess, in a way. But they were pop in their time. Ronnie Carroll, I played tunes from Amsterdam, you know, Eurovision Song Contest from the 50s. And so I enjoyed the kind of, there's a certain kind of part of me that enjoyed the sort of sentimentality of that world. And the sort of way whereby, you know, someone could do a ballad and all these guys would be crying in their beer. I played at Sunday night at the London Palladium with the tap dancer Will Gaines. Tom Jones was top of the bill, and we had this whole thing of going around in the roundabout, you know, waving, you know, like that's when Jimmy Tarbuck was running it. So that pop world I knew, and that sort of popular world, rather. And I didn't despise it, because I met some very intelligent and very clever people. Roy Castle I worked with for a long time, a very bright guy. Val Doonican, in spite of his cardigan and his armchair, is actually not, he's a very clever fellow. And so that I had a respect for their work. I mean, I thought that to a certain extent they weren't pushing that far, because the criterion for success for them was making money. And that was not necessarily my criterion. So in that way that, you know, if someone like Tom Waits worked with me, he wasn't doing that for money. I mean, I think there's a little biography of Tom which says that for him this was actually art.
And how did you first start working with Tom Waits? How did that come about?
Well, Tom got in touch with me, I guess in the late 80s. In fact, he got in touch with Jane, my manager, indirect, so it was indirect, that he had lost his recording of Jesus Blood, the first obscure record, which was his favorite record. And I thought, gosh, that's high praise to be the favorite record of Tom Waits. And he wondered if we had a copy, and as it happens, there was a copy in the office, and we were able to give him one. And I think the deal was he gave me 2 tickets for his performance in Hammersmith, and ironically I couldn't go, so there were 2 empty seats, and people were begging for tickets outside.
So we play a bit of that first recording of Jesus Blood now?
Yeah, if you like. Yeah. Well, in a second. Then Tom and I got in touch a little bit later. We sort of stayed in touch a little bit, occasionally sending each other messages. And then I started this plan for an opera called Dr. Ox's Experiment. And in this, there's this kind of couple of strange people who come into the scene who are from out of town, who are not from this world. And I had this idea that Tom Waits would be that person. And at that, in 89, 90, Tom was working with Bob Wilson, who I'd worked with in the early 80s. And so we met briefly when he did the premiere of The Black Rider in Paris. And I asked him about the possibility of doing Ox, and he was interested. And then, before Ox developed, the Jesus Blood remake was considered. And so I then had the idea of adding him to that. So that's where that came in, and then I spent a day recording with him in Northern California, but we can hear some of that if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
well,
sure.
in fact, most people know what this piece sounds like, but one of the things, after we'd released it, the piece was attacked in the popular press, especially I think the Star and the Sun for a while, and they decided we were exploiting the homeless, and they wanted to have this idea to find the old man whose voice we'd used and to give him the royalties. And so, well, we tried to find him in 1971, but 1993, odds are he's not around. But eventually they relented and then started praising the piece. But we did a version, a single of the piece, as a kind of charity for shelter. And so we made this version of a single, which was rather like the original version. But then, because with singles, as I remember, there was always a B-side, but now you don't have B-sides, you have a remix. So we did a remix in which we kind of reversed everything. So a lot of things that I'd recorded with Tom, which were not in the album, we made it into this remix. So the piece actually starts with Tom singing through a megaphone and me playing this harmonium, which only had 1 pedal. And then the old man comes in later. So we did this second version. So you can have a little bit of that if you want it.
Sure.
This is all so technical. There you go.
So that shifts from the Tom Waits version through to what I guess is the original version, right? With the sample of this homesman singing.
I've never ever in my life called it a sample, but that's what we call it now. Yes, it's what we call it.
But there's a story there with that original loop, that original tape loop that you used for the piece in the early 70s, whereby when you did come to track or try to track the guy down, the guy singing, I mean, you couldn't find him. Was that?
No. I mean, it was some time after I got the original tape from which I made the recording. Before I actually made the piece, it's one thing like to another. First I tried to make a loop, and then a little bit later I sketched out a piano accompaniment, and then later I recorded the loop onto a long reel of tape, and then I thought about orchestrating, and it's a period of months. And so by the time I'd done that, and this was not, then we did a live performance in 1972 when we did the first performance of the Titanic. And by then it's about maybe almost 2 years since the recording had been made. And the man, it was made in the process of a friend making a film about people living rough around Waterloo and Elephant and Castle. And the people who made the film vaguely remember what it looked like. He doesn't appear in the film. There's no image of him. There's nothing else of him that remains, apart from this 26 seconds or so of audio that I rescued from being thrown away. So that's all we have of him. That's what remains. And
why did you rescue that audio?
Well, it was by accident. I mean, the friend who made the film, Alan Power, he asked me if I'd help just mix some tapes, some ambient tapes, when he was making this film. And then all the tapes that he no longer needed, the reel-to-reel tapes, he gave me. These were big reels in the big boxes, which were quite expensive, and none of us had any money, and a big reel of tape was worth something, so we could use it for another project. And normally I would probably bulk erase that, but for some reason I decided to just listen through to this tape, and I listened through to it, and there were all sorts of things. There were interviews with people. These old guys were mostly drunk. Some would break into songs, some would talk about their lives, they would talk about all sorts of stuff. It went on for about, maybe an hour, 2 hours. But then in the middle of this, there was this one moment where this voice sang, and this was this voice, and I was struck by it. And it turned out afterwards that he was the only one out of all the ones they filmed who he didn't drink at all. He was just down on his luck. And I was just very powerfully struck by it. There was something in the voice itself. I thought it had a real quality. There was real music in that voice. There was also a certain kind of dignity, and also a kind of simple humanity as well, and faith, I guess. Though if Jesus had ever let anybody down, he'd let him down. But there was something about it which I couldn't identify, and so I just focused on it.
And what was the song that he was singing?
Well, one of the advantages, one of the things in the first instance was that I didn't know this song. And I was brought up as a child in East Yorkshire, going to church on Sunday twice, playing piano for my mother, running the Sunday school. So I knew religious songs very well. I knew hymns very well. I could still sing most of them from memory. I go to a friend's funeral. I know most of them by heart, even though I don't go to church anymore. But this one I didn't know at all. And so that was one of the things that struck me. And in fact, subsequently, I've always thought of it as perhaps, at the time I thought maybe it was from some sort of gospel tradition or some sort of, low church somewhere. But later, my publisher actually put out a search through real specialists to find out what is this music. And every search they make comes back to my version of it. They've never found the original. And so the ultimate decision now is, in all probability, he made it up, he improvised it. And that, I think, in a way, makes it even more touching than if he was singing like Rock of Ages or, What a Friend I Have in Jesus. This is for me now, is even more powerful because of that knowledge.
What kind of reactions did you have when Tom Waits then came to record that?
Well, the day I spent with Tom was fantastic. He was, I made this decision about using Tom, and he agreed to do it. And we recorded everything else in the autumn of 1991, I guess, 92. And Tom was working in Europe with Bob Wilson on, I think, Alice in Wonderland in Hamburg. So we recorded everything else in New York, and it was all done. So I thought we'll let Tom have his, holiday, go back home, see his family in California, and we're starting the new year and add him in. And then he disappeared, and no one knew where he was. And people were trying to find him. We tried him through his manager, directly through phones, faxes, letters, through his accountant, all kinds of people, friends, and nobody could find him. And this went on for 3 months. And I was teaching at the time, and I would come home and just leave a message and keep trying. Eventually, there was a kind of a notional release of this album, I think in probably May, end of April, May, I think. And so I really had to do it. And so, eventually one day I went into teach and came back at 6 o'clock, and I got back and I left a message on his answering machine saying, we really would like to do this, but if you can't do it, we'll go ahead and make the mix without you. And sorry it never happened, but it was a great idea. That was it. Then, in fact, I went to the pub and had a sandwich and caught up on the Guardian newspaper and went back and I checked my messages and there was no reply, but I thought I'll try one more time. And I tried again, and this time it was a different outgoing message. It wasn't the message that I'd heard before. So I knew someone was there. So I left another message. And then a couple of hours later, there was a message on my voicemail. I actually still have it because it was one of those little micro cassettes. So I stored that. I actually have it somewhere on a DAT tape. And I said, "Hey, Gavin, this is Tom Waits. Really, man, I'm real sorry about this stuff." And it was, and he'd just gone through a bad patch, and he really wanted to do it. So we did. So what happened was that I went to New York to meet all the engineers and everything, but he insisted that he would only do it in his studio in California with only me and his engineer, nobody else. So I had to go to New York and pick up a big, like 2-inch multi-track, big reel, and fly to San Francisco, stay overnight at the airport, hire a car, drive up Northern California. I remember this rented car. It was the first time I'd ever been in a car that locked when you set off. I'd never encountered that before. And then I turned on the radio and going over the Golden Gate Bridge, it was the Beach Boys. I thought, this is paradise. Anyway, we got up there and I got the directions. This place was previously been a chicken farm called Prairie Sun Studios. And it was the right place. Tom wasn't there. He was coming later. I knew that. He arrived with his wife, with Kathleen, and 2 children. She was pregnant with a 3rd child, who was later born, called Sullivan. And they'd been to a comic book convention by the coast. He lived near Santa Rosa. And then we just spent the day working. They went off. And the first thing we found was that their machines there couldn't handle the big reels, so we had to cut the reel in 2. So we could only work in 15-minute sections rather than 30-minute. And we did the first 50 minutes or so where he was in a sound booth, And he started singing, and the engineer said, "Hey, Tom, I see you're not smoking?" He says, "It's a family meeting." So he sang for 15 minutes, and then we tried again, and then he said we'd like to try in another space. They had all these different rooms, and there's one which was called the waiting room, where he had all his instruments, he recorded all his albums. And in there, he had this beautiful old mic, and he had this harmonium and drums and banjos and stuff. And so he recorded there, and I was there with him, and the engineer was in the other space, and I was just standing next to him as he sang. And he would sing these, maybe a sequence of maybe 5 or 6 repetitions in real time. So unlike the tramp who is looped, he's not, he's singing in real time. That's the fundamental difference. And he would sing along, and then after maybe developing an idea, he sort of then moved to something else. He'd sort of feel his way through a repetition, then he'd start another route. And it was just like watching, his eyes were closed, it's like just watching a great blues singer in action. It was really fantastic. And I realized when I went back later, I dropped, he asked me how, he was going to get his wife to bring him back. I had this rented car and I was staying overnight. I said, I'd drop him off back in Santa Rosa. And I then took the tape back. When I listened to it back in New York, I realized that with all the versions he sang, he never once sang it right. Not one of them is correct. Fantastic. They're all great, but none of them is right. So that was the day we were working with Tom. But we agreed 2 things. One was that we would never do this live. This was a one-off. A lot of people have tried to get us to do it live and so on, and I just say no. There was one possibility, I think, of a charity for the homeless in New York where we considered it, but that fell through because it became commercialized.
Why is that important to you to
well, it's important to him that we did this. It was really a single experience. We didn't want to exploit it. And the other aspect also dealt with exploitation. He said, hey, Gavin, if some bastard ever makes a wine called Jesus Blood, we're not going to allow them to use it for advertising. That was the other reason.
That's a good reason.
So the 2 things.
One thing we haven't talked about, but I think it's probably quite...
several things.
But I think quite obvious from some of these images, is how particular your work often is to a certain space, whether it's this, I don't know, these caves, is this in the Faroe Islands?
Yeah.
Or the piece that you did that Jean-Hubert Martin, the curator, commissioned, or again a piece at St Ives in Cornwall. How quite often you make these works that are, I guess, initially performed in a certain place, whether that's a small chapel or a kind of chateau. And I'd like to talk a little bit just about that kind of, about what that might mean for you as a composer to work with that kind of space in mind, and then what happens afterwards with the recording, how that relates to that initial performance, well, what kind of status that recording has as a document or as a standalone kind of piece.
Well, I think one of the things I learned from really being immersed in the fine art world for a long time, and there was a 3-year period when I stopped writing altogether. 1970 to 75, I wrote no music at all, and I just studied and taught the work of Marcel Duchamp, and I became a member of the College of Pataphysics and all sorts of things. I felt that just writing music, which was nice to hear, was not enough. Duchamp had a horror of what he called retinal art, which simply stops at the eye. It's beautiful to look at. It's that what we used to call in art schools a talented pencil syndrome. It's great. People have these incredible skills, but in fact it's nothing. It's empty. It's beautiful, but it's empty. So that's why I was interested in conceptual art, because the appearance of something was not the prime thing. There had to be something else there as well. And that was something I learned from the visual arts. And so, where you perform something, the situation of performance, the relationship with an audience, like Duchamp said again, the creative act. A work of art is completed by the viewer. Until someone looks at the work of art, it is not a work of art. It's just something that someone has made. Similarly, until you actually perform something in real time, in a real space, the real public, it's just an idea, which is what the Titanic was ultimately. So the spaces and so on are important, and sometimes projects come up where this is the nature of the project. Someone, I was asked to do a piece for the opening of the Tate Liverpool. I was asked to do a project at the Tate St Ives. I was asked to do this installation in Waron, this Centre for Contemporary Culture and Painting in central France. And so these things, you then look at these as art ideas. And in fact, there was a broadcast recently on Radio 3, I caught it because, well, in the summer I live in Canada, but I caught it on iPlayer, that but with Jesus' Blood, and two people were talking about it. One of them, Robert Hewison, said that for him, the interesting thing about Jesus' Blood was that it comes out of the art world. It's a found object. It's been processed in the way an artist would process material, not the way a composer would do it. A composer would develop it. An artist would kind of leave it alone and enhance it in some way. And I think he's right. You know, that Titanic, Jesus' Blood do come out of the art world, and that stays with me, so that if I find, you know, there is an opportunity to do something whereby you have an interesting space or interesting people to work with, or just there's something else other than just music, I will grasp it and I will leap for it. And so there are many of these. And of course I write, you know, things like operas, string quartets, choral music and all that sort of stuff, you know. That's a day job. And this is my sort of working as a petrol pump attendant at night, you know, I sneak out and do some other stuff when the boss isn't looking.
I think we can probably move to questions sometime.
We can keep talking forever.
Yeah. So if anyone does have a question, I think there's a hand right at the front here. And yeah, if you could just wait for the mic as well.
You mentioned sort of not getting commissions from the BBC for the sort of art college boys. And I remember when there was sort of rapprochement with the BBC when they commissioned you to do a thing, I think it was called The War in Heaven, and Howard Skempton to do Lento and things like that. I really enjoyed The War in Heaven, but I've not heard it since, and I'm not sure it's been done since. So well, how did that thing work for you? Well,
here's a commercial plug. In fact, ironically, it has been done since very recently. The War in Heaven was a commission for a big piece. In fact, the producer at the BBC, Martin Cotton, who was a producer of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, was the first person who put any of my work on the radio. I had one little piece broadcast in 1969, then nothing else until 1987. That's a measure of how far we were from, you know, established means of exposure. But Martin Cotton put on some performances in 87. I did some things at the Almeida. He did several studio concerts, did a radio performance for an orchestral piece I'd done. And so I got more and more things. And Martin was the person who commissioned me to do The War in Heaven. This piece is a cantata, a big piece. It's going to be half of a programme live at the Royal Festival Hall, live on Radio 3, with the whole BBC Symphony, the BBC singers, BBC Symphony Chorus, and two soloists. And so it's a big piece. And it was challenging, and the piece was based on two texts. One, I was working in the theatre, the Haymarket Theatre in Leicester, and during the course of the time I worked there was a wonderful performance by a great American actor, Joe Chaikin, who did a monologue by Sam Shepard called The War in Heaven, which is about a kind of fallen angel. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, and it's a fantastic performance. And I was given the Joe's typescript, which shows where it should pause, where it should breathe, and so on. I had that. And I always thought this is a fantastic piece. And now I did a lot of work on early English poetry, 7th century, especially Caedmon. And I found that Caedmon had actually, apart from doing the creation hymn, the thing he was best known for, had started to translate sections of the Bible, or transliterate them, into the lay language. And he did Genesis as a book called Genesis A, which is in Old English, 7th century Anglo-Saxon, or Northumbrian technically, where he does that. But Genesis, as we started it in the beginning, is line 113. So you have 112 lines which precede this, and this section is traditionally called the War in Heaven. It's the battle between God and the fallen angels. So what I did was to have the chorus sing this Anglo-Saxon stuff, and the soloist to sing the Sam Shepard monologue. And I had two singers, and I had them sing as like as a very high soprano and a countertenor, and they sing. I had them as like newsreaders, alternated, like, you know, Anna Ford and Reginald Bosanquet at the time, you know, alternating lines. Almost like you get it on Sky Sports News all the time. You know, this girl who says something, the guy who says something, and that's where I did the piece. And it was a big piece. And in fact, I flew off immediately after that to complete the Tom Waits project. The next morning, I flew off, and I think the piece was actually sort of roundly hammered by a lot of the press. The performance was great. There was a microphone problem, and it was nice being at the concert with Howard's Lento. And they also had the Ives 3 places in New England. I think it was Simon Jolly conducted. He did a great job. And it's a piece I was very fond of, but it got sort of lost. It's too big to do. And then a couple of years ago, Netherlands Radio got in touch, and they said they were interested in doing this piece. And I thought, well, you must be mad. Because the high soprano part is ridiculously high. At the very end of the piece, you have the soprano and the countertenor, and they both start on an E in octaves. The countertenor is E above middle C. This might be gibberish for most people anyway, but believe me. And then the soprano is E at the top of the stage. And then they sing this scale, which goes up an octave. So the soprano finishes on a very, very high E, massively high, with virtually no accompaniment in octaves with the countertenor, who's also very high. And then it has to hold this note and fade to nothing, and four solo violins just play a little chord again. I thought, well, I knew the singers I had in 1993 could do it, but is it really common ability for people to do that? Anyway, they found a young Austrian soprano who could do it, a very good Dutch countertenor. As a result of that, we performed it in Amsterdam just over a year ago. And from various fiddles, I've started my own record company. And one of the things I've...
And yeah.
Okay, I think this will have to be the last one for tonight.
Thanks. I wondered if you had a view on whether we're at the start of something in terms of the type of work you've done. You know, is there a you know, over the next 20, 30, 50 years, can it develop into something, or is it a body of work which kind of finishes with its generation? I mean, for what it's worth, I'm a lowly fine art student, and I knew nothing of your work until about 6 months ago, or any experimental music. I'd never even heard of John Cage, and through a number of fortuitous circumstances, I became aware of it started with Jesus' Blood, actually, and then I've become aware of so much, and it's profoundly changed my work in the last few months, the work I've been doing this summer. And so it feels to me like there's so much scope for it. But I just wondered what your view on that, and if there is scope for a lot more work in that kind of area, whether it's more fine art or whether it's now more in music.
I think the answer is this, I haven't got 50 years left, but, well, I can work on it, but I'd be pretty boring old fart by the time I'm 120. But no, one of the ironies is you struggle and you find ways, because I was essentially self-taught, and so I wrote my first opera when I'd done nothing at all in that area. And eventually, little by little, you develop confidence and knowledge and craft. And then I'm in a situation now whereby there's actually nothing phases me at all. I'll happily write for anything at all, and I know how to do it. Yet, you run out of time. That's the irony. You get all this and then bye-bye. But in terms of evolving, I think there's a lot more for me to do, and a lot more things for me to do which are not exactly what I've been doing before. And one of the problems that people have, if you set yourself up in certain ways, you're expected to follow that path. It's a thing you see in the fine art world. Wouldn't people have been shocked if Frank Stella did some sort of portraits sometime? No stripes anymore. Or if, Donald Judd did sort of sculptural heads. Sol LeWitt, started doing kind of landscapes. People would think this is horrible. And I remember Philip Glass, I went to a concert of his in Philadelphia in the early 80s, and he did with this album, he'd just done this album Glassworks, and he played one of these pieces, which is quite a slow melody thing, and he was really worried. He was concerned. He said, Gavin, do you think I can get away with this? I said, Philip, for God's sake, it's a relief. Get away, do more of it. We had plenty of that fast chugging stuff, They all sound the same anyway. Just get on with it. In fact, some of it is. I mean, he lifts his own stuff all the time, we know that. But so there's a sense in which people identify you. You have a certain kind of style, and the style is just the way in which you write music. But there's a sense in which you can sort of perpetuate yourself within the genre, and people will know it's you because it sounds just like the last piece, or very similar. It's just different instruments a bit more, so you can hear a Michael Nyman advert, who's done it. Hear Philip Glass one, straight away. But what I think is more interesting is to find each time what is the nature of the material I'm working with. And this is a kind of a fine art way of working. You have a project to work on something, and you think, what is this? What can I make with it? Recently I did a couple of weeks ago, there was the first Samuel Beckett Festival at Enniskillen, a festival called Happy Days. And I was commissioned to write some settings of Samuel Beckett's poetry. And I felt that the way in which I'd set other poets, in each case when I've set a poet, I've looked exactly how they've made their poetry, the structure, the imagery, the rhythm, the way they use metaphors, all kinds of things have colored the way in which I write the music. And I felt that with Beckett, his poetry was like none of this, and also his poetry is not that well known. And so I approached it in a very different way, and I think the Beckett songbook that I've done these songs is very different from a lot of the other things I've done. And I will continue to do this. I've got quite a lot of pieces to write over the next few years, and I'll see what they are within themselves rather than think, how does this fit within the line of pieces that I'm writing? This is my oeuvre, and I'm going to sort of perpetuate it in some ways. And I've consciously, well, not consciously, but at the back of my mind, I'm aware that there are times when time has been short and you have ripped yourself off and you have done something which necessarily you've borrowed from a previous work, and I hate myself when I do it. I find a way of concealing it as best I can, whereas, Nyman and Philip, they don't conceal it at all. This is it, this is what I do, chugga, chugga. So it's a question of renewing yourself, and yeah. So, I mean, when I did Jesus' Blood, first time, someone said, what are you going to do next? Buddha's blood? Muhammad's blood? You get world religion. Let's do an atheist one as well. When I did the Titanic, there was a thing in Music and Musicians which said that this next news piece of Gavin Bryars was called the Krakatoa Explosion. And in this, a solo viola stands on a piece of rock that had come from Krakatoa and plays this piece for about 40 minutes. Someone imagine that's what I'll be doing after the Titanic. I'm not a disaster composer. I'm not a religious composer. I'm not a composer who always uses found material. I find, if something falls in my lap, I find a way of doing with it. Someone shows me some new poetry, I'll think what I can do with it. There's a lot of stuff I find, I think, well, there's nothing I can do with this. It's nice, but it's not me.
I think that's a nice place to end on.
Is it?
I think we continue the conversation in the bar. Gavin, Sam, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. This is brilliant.
Well, thanks, Sam, too.